that when you use the chat box that you respond to everyone rather than privately. If it's something that you have a question about privately, then you can go ahead and send us an email and we will answer you as promptly as possible. So without further ado, I'm going to remove my video camera and just go ahead and start sharing my screen with you so we can get started. This video session is being recorded for just your own background information, that we're using this as help for us to kind of see where we need work and improvement, and if there's the opportunity to post that actual presentation onto our faculty development website, we're going to go ahead and do that versus create a separate one. So without further ado, our focus for our feedback really is this time on craft and communication of language that is really supporting of how we're going to construct feedback. So our session objectives is we really want to encourage a collaborative here at Baker College, and that is both online and on ground. And so we're so happy that we have a variety of disciplines being represented. We have marketing and business and healthcare, and so that is really helpful for that collaboration to really thrive. We're also going to be looking at understanding feedback for different purposes, different levels, and different outcomes, and that will be an evolving objective for us as we're continuing on with this three-part session of feedback. And then really this last one is a thinker. Engage in conscious exchange of dialogue, inquiry, practice, and application of feedback approaches. So that's kind of where outside of these sessions here you may be asked to continue dialogue with a partner in your action plan. And we really want to foster that, and that is in particular response to a lot of feedback that we've gotten that some people feel like they're working on an island. And teaching here with us at Baker, you are part of our family, and we want you to feel like you are a part of, you have somebody that you can communicate with and talk to and get support when you need it, and to provide support to others as part of our Baker family. So without further ado, I want you to just take a moment to think for yourself these questions as you reflect on your action plan. And I did ask earlier, did you have a chance to share and even provide feedback in your action plan? So what did you notice about yourself as the giver of feedback? And what impacts did the feedback have on your feed up approach? So we're going to go ahead and open the conversation in the chat box, and remember to respond to everyone so that we can kind of get your, did you have some really good things that you noticed about yourself? Did you notice some challenges? And this is our collaborative forum where we can just be honest with each other about what's happening using the feed up strategies that you've designed for yourself. Some of the things you may have noticed is just the way that you organize things. You can see Diane. Thanks, Diane, for that. It's really enjoying to give feedback to peers and sometimes to get feedback to peers. And I appreciate that response in terms of, sometimes you don't necessarily do that with a colleague, especially in an adjunct position. And Jack raises something that I'm glad that he did. This challenge of putting yourself as the receiver of feedback, if you could maybe talk about that a little bit more, Jack, in terms of what might have been some of those challenges, or even anybody else want to chime in. Did you also experience some challenges in terms of receiving the feedback? Maybe it was not what you expected. Maybe it was just like, this doesn't make sense. So, Diane says it was enjoyable, but others might say it was a challenge for them. Yes, yeah. That critical factor, sometimes we're so used to being critical of our students' work that when it comes to colleagues, we have to really ground ourselves and say, okay, this is a fellow professional like me, and I don't want to come across in an offensive way. So that's why I had you do that, and I'm glad that you mentioned it. I really wanted you to center your feedback on, I noticed, I wonder, and what if, and even that construction can be a challenge. And those same challenges are often presented to us when we're providing feedback to students. So we have to be mindful of that, and we'll talk about that. You don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, but at the same time, there are probably some things that need to be said. And Jelena mentions that, providing feedback or getting feedback from peers is helpful, and then hoping that the feedback that was received was well-intentioned and constructive. And I found some, some were, and some were like, okay, I'm not sure that I'd use this, and some were really helpful for me, like the ADA compliance, if you had a chance to respond to mine. I think that was something that was brought up over and over again. And Jim has brought up this idea of motivation, and we'll talk about motivation too. So feel free to carry on the conversation within the chat box. I am going to move forward with the remainder of the presentation here. So this is intended also to be used as an instructional tool, okay? So I've asked you a reflective question. If you're thinking about how to feed up, this is actually a feed up strategy that you can use at the beginning of a week. So I wanted to share with you also again, and at the start of our feed up session, we did talk about our norms of collaboration. These are available on our faculty development website just as statements of our work as IESs, and then I can see a lot of evidence of how faculty are starting to see this as collaboration. You will notice a shift in our professional development strategies in more collaborative, more engaging ways as opposed to sit and get. We've kind of gone away from that because we want you to feel part of a collaborative, being part of our Baker family. Okay, so just kind of revisiting this three-pronged approach and where we are. Last time we talked about feed up, and that's ensuring that students understand the purpose of the assignment or lesson, and a lot of you put together your action plans to represent that. And that really answers the question for students, where am I going? Right now we're going to be focusing on feedback, and that feedback provides students with information about their successes and their needs. So we're really in an assessment evaluatory perspective here in feedback, and that's how am I doing? You may find yourself starting to lean toward feed forward, and that's guiding students learning based on performance data. Where am I going next? So for the purposes of our conversation, we are focused on how am I doing, but you may find in the practice opportunities today that you want to delve into the feed forward, and I'm okay with that. Just know that the emphasis, a real emphasis on that, won't come until a little bit later. This work does come from Fisher and Fry, and even though we're talking about feedback, this isn't meant to be in a formative way. So thinking about feedback in a formative way, how can I really encourage that feedback loop process? So I wanted to share with you also just some background information about what formative feedback might look like. I'll give you a second just to look over this and see what your identifiers are, see if you can identify how you relate to this as far as formative feedback. So basically what formative feedback is and is not. So when we look at the restructuring of Baker courses, we now have a lot of rubrics embedded within them, thankfully. And so how are we providing formative feedback that is in relation to those learning targets in the rubrics, but also the course SLOs and some of those big ideas. So when we provide feedback, it's very targeted on those learning targets. Formative feedback also identifies strengths and areas of growth. So while Carol and I probably see a lot more on this areas of you need to do this, you need to do that, specifically related to the Grade Center, more along those lines, we want to make sure that we're balancing this with strengths and areas of growth. We recognize that this is not just feedback on an assignment, this is students' academic journey. And so we want to make sure that we balance strengths and areas of growth. I see Diane and Carol starting to have a conversation about formative and summative, and carry on that conversation there because we'll talk about the difference between formative and summative feedback as a whole group too. But back to the chart, making sure that formative feedback is timely, can immediately be used for immediate progress. So if you're starting to look at those first three categories, formative feedback offers the opportunity for continuous improvement. It is risk-free, and it is an opportunity for students to say, okay, I know where I'm at right now, where do I go to improve this, and how do I kind of launch into this next learning? Summative is really like that final stamp. You passed or you didn't, here is your final score, and you can see based on what formative feedback is not, it's a lot of that grading and coding and scoring that we're often using to determine students' proficiency on an assessment. So it's usually the final result of an assessment. So Diane says, like formative and summative assessments, summative feedback would appear at the end of a unit, chapter, et cetera, really not necessarily an opportunity for students to improve on that particular assessment. The tricky thing here is that formative assessments derive from summative assessments. So summative assessments might be, okay, the end of the week task, but when we're providing formative feedback, it's also in the way of saying this is how we can improve for the next task. So it gets a little tricky. Formative is the practice, and summative is the final product. We can often use results from the final product in order to guide our next steps. So related to that descriptive specific in the form of questions, I want you to ask yourself, how many of you, excuse me, do formative feedback for students specifically in the grade center? And which ones do you find yourself leaning to more often? And it's okay if you say all of them. It's okay if you're like, you're making me think. So looking at the formative feedback, which of these do you think that you lean toward more than the others? That's a good point, Diane. And we want to make sure that we ourselves are operating in a formative mindset, that this is an opportunity to help students practice and then provide them those feedback so that they can improve for next time. So this chart might be helpful for some of you in thinking about, okay, I know it's not just general comments, good job, way to go, hoorah. It's not just editing of mistakes. And Carol and I do find that quite a bit in some of the grade center feedback. It's providing after the learning is over, it's provided after the learning is over or at the end, and that is representative of summative feedback. So Linda says, strengths and areas of growth. Christine says encouraging scores and feedback each week. And then thanks for bringing up this opportunity to talk about what you might be able to improve on too. And recognizing that maybe our feedback is in this area. And so this session will really help you kind of identify, why am I providing feedback in this way? And we recognize that we do have to provide feedback in terms of grades and scores. That is kind of a non-negotiable with grading. But we don't need to necessarily live into that as the sole way that we provide feedback. Yeah, thanks, Bonnie. Timely feedback is really important, and students really, really value timely feedback so that they can make the adjustments. So I wanted to share with you a couple of examples. If you're using the computer and you can see the screen, this is an example of an assignment. It's not the entire assignment. And taking a look at the comments on the right. So we're gonna post positive intentions here. That's our norms of collaboration. And thinking about just the feedback that you see on the right.
Has joined the meeting.
You see 3 comments. And I've also provided you with the language of cognitivist and socio-constructivist. We talked about that last time. Cognitivist is, I'm just going to give you the answer, just do this, and it kind of stops the communication, which that has its place. And socio-constructivist is this dialogue. Okay, so what are some things that you're noticing, maybe the type of feedback, common features, and just these 3 brief statements to the student? And I've had 2 examples, so I'll go ahead and start this one. Nothing is wrong with a cognitivist approach, Michael. It has its place. So what we're noticing in this particular type of feedback is a lot of this is corrective. The instructor is finding that she has to clarify, a term. Not all triggers are the same for each person. This is an overgeneralization. Okay, thinking about that as feedback. Some of it's corrective, and some of it is judgmental in the terms of making this statement as an overgeneralization. It's not a personality, it's a personality disorder, not a mood disorder. Okay, so then there's a comment, okay? There's some reteaching maybe that needs to be done here. Bonnie says there's nothing positive about this feedback. And if you've got maybe some positives that this faculty might be able to include in here, please do share. This sounds like you're talking about bipolar disorder. Elevated mood is related to bipolar, not bipolar PD. Okay, I don't have necessarily the context here, and I don't need to be able to think about this in terms of, you know, how is this helping the student moving forward? Yes, this is saying where the student is, but it provides maybe a limited scope as far as how to move forward. I'm just looking at the chat box here with Phyllis's comment. I provide summative, and they actually did. I also provide formative so they understand what is expected on future assignments. That would be a good example. Okay? And then here is another example. And I should say, if you look at the arrows, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, this is the assignment right here. But there are more comments to come. So what are you noticing about this feedback in particular? Either it's construction or it's approach, is it cognitive, social cognitive, constructivist? And I should say that if you're not using the inline comments feature, either on a Word document or using the Crocodoc feature, that is good practice, and we would really promote that, encourage that, because that is the first way that students will actually, if they look at the feedback, they will probably look at that first, well, outside of the grade. And this would be a good feed-up strategy to say, please read the inline comments as I've asked you some questions. Okay? What are some things that you're noticing about this particular feedback? So remember, these are summative assignments. This is something that is going to be graded. And the instructor might be using this as actually a teachable moment. And what I would suggest here is let's turn this into a formative way to be able to say, rather than explain this to all the students, maybe some reteaching needs to be done on the discussion board. Maybe this is announcements for students if we see this pattern repeating. Imagine the amount of time it takes for the instructor to put this together and all this writing after reading, you know, a simple paragraph. Like, that's a lot of work. And so what are some things that we can do, particularly in the discussion board, to really foster those formative practice opportunities? And I mean no judgment on this. This is just an example of, you know, while this feedback might be helpful for the student, there are different ways that we can provide feedback and different purposes to reach students in different ways. When we look at assessment feedback, one of the articles I shared with you last time is talking about, you know, assessment feedback specifically in higher ed. And one of the resources taken from that is the Nelson and Shun work, identifying 3 broad meanings of assessment feedback, both motivational, influencing beliefs and willingness to participate. And that a lot of people, somebody mentioned that earlier, that feedback is really intended to be motivational, like I want to improve. And if you remember from our feed up, it's this mindset that, you know, I want to do it, it's important to me, I can do it, I will do it. And this is really piggybacking off of those ideas. The other broad meaning for assessment feedback is really reinforcement to reward or to punish specific behaviors. Here at Baker, we want to make sure that we're rewarding behaviors and also gently reminding of specific behaviors. And we'll talk about that just a little bit more. And the last one is informational, to change performance in a particular direction. And so as you're thinking about the feedback that you've provided maybe in the past week to students, whether it is on the discussion board or in the grade center, you know, was it motivational? Did it promote reinforcement of ideas and behaviors? Was it informational? And so you can take a look at your own work and be conscientious of how you're providing your feedback and for what reason. I think Jelena is asking the question, how effective is inline feedback for programming assignments and projects? Are you talking specifically, Jelena, in the programming field? Is that what you're referring to? I just need a little bit more clarification. Overall, I think I've seen inline comments used on PowerPoint presentations. I've seen them used on Word documents, on Publisher documents. We can even use those features in Google Docs and on Word documents. So as we're moving forward, here I'm going to share with you 4 levels of feedback. And, you know, if you want to take notes, you certainly can, but this is being recorded so you can watch this again. So think about the feedback that you just saw, and is this feedback about the task, which is really corrective feedback designed to address or correct misunderstandings. And there are actually three ways to provide feedback about the task, and that is direct corrective, providing the student with the correct answer information, and I think you might have seen an example of that. Here's a mathematical example. You should reread section 6, kind of directing the student as far as what to do. You'll want to include a transition between these two ideas. And so if we think about direct corrective and the long-term progress for students' self-regulation, it is actually quite limited. So you are finding yourself as the expert in the room, but also you're directing students to do this and do that. And as adult learners, while some will respond well to do that and change their behaviors, most will not. They're independent thinkers and they want to do their own thing. So in terms of the longevity of it, we're finding it not necessarily having the exact same impact. There's indirect corrective, identifying an error but maybe not providing the correction to it. You might identify, oh, go back to this discussion board labeled this. And so, you know, the student has actually a little bit more of a guide. This might be more helpful in terms of the self-regulation on behalf of students. And then finally is metalinguistic corrective and provides a clue about the types of errors for the student to correct. So if you would in the chat box, where do you find yourself providing feedback about the task? Is it direct corrective, indirect, or metalinguistic? And I would make the assumption that most people are in this camp about providing corrective feedback about the task. So Bonnie says hers are more indirect corrective, and I guess my question is that helpful for students? What are you finding might be some results in helping you understand, is this helpful for students? So these conversations, much like the session outcomes, are really intended to help you think. What is my practice, and what are maybe some shifts I would like to make with my practice? Okay, and there's quite a conversation there talking about direct corrective. There's still conversation about using rubrics as opposed to inline comments, maybe a blend of both. All right, I'm going to share with you the other types of feedback. This is really interesting and more sophisticated. So this is not just about the task or the assignment. This kind of broadens about the processing of the task. And that is to develop students' ownership of their process. If you think about one of the assignments in your course, do you demonstrate for them the process for completing that task, or a process for completing that task? And are those practice opportunities available to students? So did you use the first outside-inside last procedure, maybe in mathematical terms? Here's a question. How did you plan to utilize your secondary sources within the assignment? Notice the word plan. Maybe the student hadn't planned at all. Well, that is part of that student's processing, but thinking about now you understand that the student should probably have a conscious process of how to utilize those secondary sources. I can see you're predicting here, and that seems to be working for you. So if you think about Bloom's taxonomy in terms of levels of thinking and levels of action, there's a difference between understanding as well as analysis. So these are all cognitive processes that we should be paying attention to. And when you're providing feedback to students about their process, you are calling upon their thinking of their approach to tackle the task. This removes the responsibility, or gradually pulls away the responsibility from the instructor to provide all the answers in a corrective way, and more responsibility on the student to pay attention to his or her process for approaching that task. Thanks, Pamela. Okay, I'm going to let you sit with that for a few seconds to think about, do I provide students with feedback on how they're processing the specific task? One final example, when I read this, I wondered if you remembered the discussion board on brainstorming ideas. Some people don't like that example, but I wanted to incorporate the I wondered possibility. And this is something curious, that you're not providing the answers, but you are kind of redirecting the student and thinking to yourself, do they see the connection between the discussion board and what happens on the assignment? You can start to see the shift from the task to the processing of the task is more sophisticated and asking students to be more self-regulatory. And that leads us to feedback as self-regulation. In the article that I was referring to earlier, thinking about how we as instructors really want students to be self-directed, we want them to be motivated, but what do we do to prompt that? Some faculty stick in the task portion. Well, that really doesn't promote or call upon students' self-appraisal and self-management. And this is where students must learn to assess their own ability, their own knowledge, cognitive strategies, and achievement to regulate their behaviors and actions toward the working goal. And what this looks like is your contributions to the group really seem to result in everyone understanding. For those of you that are involved in group projects, this might be something that you could latch on to. So how might the student interpret this? I did pretty good in that group, and I'm being recognized by my instructor as this contribution really helped everyone understand. If this was done in a public forum, this also might encourage others to take a more engaging approach when it comes to group projects. So we're starting to see now, oh, the student might say, I probably didn't realize that this contribution to the group was actually valuable. I'm probably going to try this again in the next opportunity that I have. This might be kind of a little negative. When you were absent from the discussion board, your performance on the writing assignment showed lower effort too, okay? We as instructors pay attention to those things, but as a self-regulatory approach, understanding that students might not see that connection between the discussion board and the performance, so we might ask a question to follow this up on, because this is really about their time management, right? This is about their contributions in one space and seeing the results in another. And so how might the student interpret this in terms of self-appraisal and self-management? The instructor really cares about me and wants me to really manage my approaches in the discussion board, because there's a direct correlation on those summative assignments as well. I think you accomplished what you set out to achieve. Do you agree? This is a great example of the feedback cycle, right? Being able to say, you know, here are the expectations, here's the feedback that I'm providing for you, do you agree? And that really encourages students to be able to say, well, I guess I do, I didn't realize this. I guess I do agree, or maybe they don't. That creates a conversation. Okay, so the last example is when you designed the graphic organizer, you seemed to get on track with the rest of the essay. Did that help you somehow? Maybe this is a new strategy, or maybe this is a strategy that the student uses. You know, if I'm referring to my own years as a college student, that was probably my opportunity to learn how to study and to learn how to navigate the expectations of the coursework. So, you know, students are in that flux period if they're not quite sophisticated at it yet. And so we as instructors need to provide them with that self-regulatory feedback to get them to a point where they feel confident and competent about themselves. The final type of feedback is feedback about the self as a person. And this is feedback that praises the attachment to the task. And this causes changes in students' effort, engagement, and efficacy. And unfortunately, my screen is cutting off here. Students perceive feedback differently as a result of feedback about the person and often connects with other feedback types. So you're a conscientious student for focusing on the group dynamics. This is really more positive feedback related to praise. I'm sure you're proud of how well you've done. You used several high-achieving strategies, and they seem to work in your favor. It looks like you found value in the assignment through your working relationships. So this type of feedback really does embody and embrace the student as a whole person. So as you think and reflect on the feedback that you've provided to students, what levels are you primarily focusing on? Is it about the task, the processing of the task, the self-regulation of student behaviors, or the student as a self as a person? And Linda's asking the question now, did that help you or expecting an answer? That really depends on your expectations and thinking about, do you want to continue the conversation? Because that conversation might actually include, you know, some modeling student to student, saying, did that really help you? And you can certainly bring that forward as a strategy for other students to chime in. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, Diane, that's great to tell our students that we're proud of them and that they're doing a fantastic job. We recognize too, we have, you know, as adult learners, we have they bring a lot of issues, they have a lot of responsibilities. They're goal-driven like we are. They want the degree, they want the job, and we're not going to fault them for that. And so sometimes they need a little pat on the back as part of feedback. So which levels of feedback are being used in the sample papers? What did you notice if you think back to those sample papers? You know, most of it was really about the task, you know, thinking about that specifically. And somebody said, you know, there's really no positive feedback and no really self-regulation, quite honestly. How did this really help support the student taking initiative and motivation on his or her own to start adjusting these behaviors? And it really didn't. It was a lot of like, this is just incorrect information. Linda shares, I'm really enjoying your engagement thus far. Keep up the good work, okay? Sometimes students also don't engage in conversation because they don't want to feel stupid and they don't want to get things wrong. So when we see those moments of risk-taking from our students, it's perfectly acceptable to say, you know, you really put yourself out there, and I'd love to hear more from you. Yeah, thanks, Jack, for that connection with rubrics and this idea of self-regulation, depending on how you frame that. And I guess my next question is, why are these levels important for our students? You know, some people might say, you know what, if I just tell them what they did wrong, they correct it, and they end up getting an A or B anyway. Okay, I can understand that. At the same time, why might these levels be important for learners talking about task, process, self-regulation, and self as a person? And I'm not suggesting we do it all at once, okay? You have to really balance and navigate each student's progress. But why might this be important for students overall? And I don't have an answer. I'm looking for some chiming in from others. So if you're finding yourself, okay, I do this and I do a little bit of that, you know, what are some things we want to keep awareness of in our practice in providing feedback to students? So we're going to do a little practice. I have an opportunity for us to practice. I say practice with the pen, but it's a little bit more involved than that. Let me get out of here and open up our document. And I will go ahead and share this example in the chat box. and you can access it just the same because you have access to it. This is Jane Smith's example. This is the actual assignment that you see. It's due on Wednesday, due 15 points. And then the second page is actually the rubric.
Has joined the meeting.
And so what I'd like for us to consider in here is you can just kind of read the results from Jane Smith. And then I'm going to toggle back here. You know, we're going to read that sample assignment provided, and I'm going to provide you with the link that we're going to be using in a shared Google document. And that's going to be in the chat box right now. So there are two documents. One's just the PDF that you can view as far as all of the expectations. And then the other document is actually Jane Smith's sample. So I have somebody in here right now. And if you log into that document, we'll be able to look at the same thing. So what I want you to do is I want you to explore the levels of feedback for this student to reflect upon. Thinking about, do I want to provide feedback on the task? Do I want to talk about the processing of the task? And if we could get like maybe 4 or 5 different people to chime in, maybe thinking about different types of comments. So we're going to be using this comments feature here, and then just the plus. So I'm just going to, example, I'm just going to write that there. And then you would comment. That's how you do it, okay? Let's see, we got 6 people involved, which is great. So if you find yourself looking at that document, you can even toggle back between that and the actual assignment if you really wanted to. But I want to just take a few minutes and practice. And then we'll be able to look at some of those practice documents and then say, okay, am I focusing on task? Am I focusing on process? I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes with that. Looks like we have several people in the document now. And if you have questions about the task, you can put them in the chat box for Carol or I. So just to give you a little bit more context, this is an assignment where the student had to write a letter of request for a letter of recommendation. This is not the thank you email that follows it. This is an actual assignment. But you can see the criteria here. Maybe I don't know if I can turn this at all, rotate it. No. But basically, the student is asked to, provide a letter of recommendation request, that, let me see if I can open it up here. Oops. Audience and purpose of the letters are strong and clear. Thinking about, what maybe some of the requirements were, demonstrates knowledge of conventions, enhances the readability. Those are exceptional. Remember, I don't want you to put a score on there. I want you to think about how you might be able to provide a comment on the student's work. So Diane asked the question, would it be helpful for the student to rewrite this letter? That is an interesting question. How might you incorporate that into student-driven feedback so that the student might be able to consider, do I need to rewrite this letter? And certainly that's an option for you, within the time constraints of the 8-week course. So I think what I'm recognizing here is I'm wondering if this isn't a challenge, thinking about the student's work and saying, okay, maybe I need a little bit more context. Maybe I need to, as in this kind of protocol, Diane's saying the tone is good and that's a positive, okay? So, what we might think about doing is thinking about what the task was. What do you think the student's process might have been for this? So for example here, I might say, this is really on the fly here, so you'll have to forgive me. And I'm just going to write that, okay? I'm even using some of the language of that processing of the task, or I can even ask a question. Okay? Maybe I'm not sure. Jack says that the request letters provide a paragraph. Okay, so let's transfer that into feedback. So if Jack, you're in here, you know, thinking about how you might be able to provide feedback to that student, knowing that the background is really something that's very important. Okay. So, you know, if you want to start this and look at it later, that's perfectly fine. But I wanted to give you at least a practice on that process of, okay, is this about, can I provide feedback about the task? Can I provide feedback about the process? And wherever you feel that the student needs the greatest level of feedback to continue. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm realizing that looks like you only have view access. You might not be able to make comments, so I apologize for that. Thanks for sharing it. But at least I got you thinking about those different levels of feedback, okay? So moving back to the presentation, and we're just about finished here. You know, that's an opportunity where maybe you want to practice with a student's assignment that you've already provided feedback on and thinking about where you would want to provide various feedback. So we've talked a little bit about this idea of feedback in terms of, you know, now you're going to respond to a student's work and kind of give them that how am I doing sort of thing. And we'll be closing that feedback in a little bit. So some of you started mentioning maybe the student really wants to revise this paper. I would love for them to, you know, thinking about that, sender verifies the message was received and they want to actually take action on it. So we're not quite yet to closing the feedback loop, but we will definitely get there. And I wanted to focus our conversation on the different levels of feedback. So your next steps then will be to review your feed up strategy and what you've done to prepare students to receive feedback. So we've just talked about 4 levels of feedback. Are the students ready to accept that type of feedback? Because students might just be operating under the feedback of, just tell me what to do. Just tell me what to do. And Carol and I can certainly attest that there are people in our profession that just say, just tell me what to do, okay? And if you're going to encourage self-regulation and give feedback on the self, they might need to know that you do care about them and that you're ready to provide that type of feedback. So, and just as you're looking at your feed up strategy, locate an assignment you plan to provide feedback on and think about the options for providing feedback at different levels. So I'm going to show you what that looks like in your action plan, and that is a living document that you will be referring to for your own well-being and then your own progress, okay? We're going to be checking in on feedback, or excuse me, the action plans on November 2nd. So even if you haven't had a chance to share with your colleague, your partner, you still have time to do that. So what that looks like, here's my sample, and I've got tons and tons of comments. And I just scrolled down to the bottom, and I said feedback reflections. How can I incorporate different levels? This is just my own language to myself. And I said, you know, week's opening thread, focus on self-regulation and self as a person. So maybe I've got 1 or 2 threads in the discussion board that I want to focus on. And then maybe for one particular assignment, I really want to focus on task and process. And that might just be, you know, 2 comments. There might be, you know, 1 comment on the task, depending on where the student is. And I've also put a section for me to collect any evidence. When I say that I'll be looking at action plans, it's really to provide you with formative feedback. There is no like, okay, if you didn't do this right, or if it's really limited in scope, that it's going to affect anything. It's just a matter of, you know, Carol and I are here to support you in your progress toward using feedback in effective ways, both for you and for your students. Okay, so that would be an example of homework. Now, this is my sample, so you probably cannot access it. I didn't provide the link, but you should open up your own action plan. Make sure that you've shared it and provide all that, the feedback to your partner, and then incorporating a feedback strategy, the different levels that you'd like to incorporate. It's just kind of some mental notes for yourself. So I'm going to give a minute just for any questions. John, I'm sorry I cannot answer your question about the entire program related to that, the context of the letter. I apologize. And then Jim shares, your letter is definitely right on track. You can read the feedback there. I think that's a good start. Yeah, kind of paraphrasing. I like that idea, paraphrasing what kind of is happening in the letter. Okay. So with response to moving forward in our first session of feedback, just kind of fielding some questions about where we've been in this specific session related to the levels of feedback, as well as moving forward into our session 2 for feedback. So if there are any additional questions, really kind of putting the onus on you. And as far as where you want to take this, I've shared with you the information, and I'm having great feedback exchange with people off the session and on email. So I encourage you to keep doing that, and patient as I respond to each one. So as we're closing out our session here, I have provided a brief Google form for you to fill out. Let me see if I can open it and see what it looks like for y'all. And this is what it should look like. There are just a few questions. How are we doing? You kind of tell us how we're doing. I'm sorry I didn't leave a space for narrative comments, but this is just a record of your attendance for our session for today. I will leave it at that. Thank you, Carol, for reviewing the chat box for us and fielding questions. Everybody, thank you so much for your engagement in these sessions. I hope that you're finding value with them and that it is helping you be more confident and reflective about your teaching. Please feel free to email Carol or I for any support that you may need in helping implementation or any additional questions. I'm going to be signing off right now. I'll just kind of share with you my aloha, and I hope everyone has a great weekend.
Has left the meeting.
And just a reminder that we do have additional sessions available on our faculty development website.
Has left the meeting.
And you can find those here
Has left
on our
the
professional
meeting.
development website.
Mary Peterson.
Has left the meeting.
Glenn Croxton.
Has left the meeting. Has left the meeting.
John DeRosiak.
Has left the meeting.
And I'll just post that survey at the end one more time. And I'm going to sign off for now. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Jack Garrison.
Has left the meeting.